free will, the brain, and Aquinas. There are a lot of pieces that are hard to get together here. And before we look at brains, I think we need to take a step back a little bit. It's when you look too closely at brain scans, we lose sight of what is really going on. I think that's part of the problem. And so I would want to do this here right now. And just first of all, to notice that brain studies about free will are published and discussed in undergraduate seminars, and immediately students lose their belief in free will, basically. I've heard that from many students, and it's important to give a response to that. If modern science seems to suggest that we don't have free will, that has consequences, and modern science is still considered one of the authorities in our culture. But I think we need to realize or come to see that that is only one part of our culture, as it is usually in all of us. And there is a compartmentalization that we have, because the same people who believe that are also very much about our ability to choose and will defend it tooth and nail. Everything must be my choice. That is my right. I have to be authentically me and have the freedom to craft my own life, including physically perhaps, into what I want to be. And freedom and choice is the highest value that we then may want to have. And that doesn't square with thinking that our brain determines everything that we do. And usually our culture thinks both, and they never the twain meet, otherwise they would see the contradiction. And to navigate that, I think, is the question of free will. And as much as we have time, I'll try to say that Thomas Aquinas does that very well. He's not an extremist in that regard. But first of all, to address the side on that emphasizes our freedom of choice, which is much part of our culture. Let us say that indeed we have that freedom, and we have it to the degree that the culture would like to have it, which is actually rather unrealistic. But if we had that, what would we do with that freedom? What would we do with that freedom? And why is that even a question? It is a question because freedom is not the highest value. Freedom is not an end in itself. Free choice is a means, not the end. There is still the question, what do we do with that, and why would we want it? What would we want it for? And the tradition has an answer to that. We don't have it anymore, and so we have all sorts of consumer options filling in the blanks for us so that we don't think about that. But I think deep down and at the bottom of it, we all want to be happy. Happiness is a sort of the term that covers what we mean by a life that succeeds, a life that is worth living, a life that has value. It is the sum total of all of that. And nobody intentionally chooses to be unhappy, which means our free choice is, on our free will, is meant to achieve happiness. That is our goal, and that is why we want to have it. And so what we consider then that happiness to be will be also an important question for free will. We can cast it even in political terms. If you think the government is evil and should keep out of our life, and then you imply our happiness is in our private homes and what we do by ourselves and the life that we craft for us in privacy. And the state is basically an enemy to these goods or just a subsidiary. And so then we just define freedom as freedom from these interferences. But if we think of freedom as something that is meant for a happiness that is in a common good, if we think that our flourishing is part to be of a common good of the political community, then we will understand freedom to be participation in that common good. Our ability to choose and deliberate in that community, that our voice is being heard, and we will not find freedom apart from that. And so freedom then becomes a matter of participation in an ultimate and common good. The most ultimate good, of course, is not the state. Common life is an important kind of thing, but the most universal good is beyond the state, it is even beyond the universe, it is God himself, the sum total of all goodness. And that is indeed what St. Thomas Aquinas would say, and also St. Augustine, that that is what we are made for, and our hearts are restless until they rest in God. And so that is the important background, that indeed we choose and want free will for that ultimate end, and we are free if we are able to achieve it. If we talk about free fall, an object falls down to what Aristotle will call its natural place. And the counter term for that is violent motion, if I would throw it at you, right? And so likewise, our natural place is God, and our freedom is to be able to go to that place rather than to be pushed in a different direction. And it's not the notion of free will that you typically encounter in the modern world, but I think it is, first of all, important to recall that, and it will have consequences at the end. Now, coming to the other side of things. So this is against exaggerated notions of freedom, or freedom that is just arbitrary or random, or a value for its own sake. The other challenge, as I said, is if people do brain studies and say, you don't have free will, we can show it to you, look at this brain scan. And here the important experiment, thank you. The important experiment, famously quoted, and it's not the only one since, but in 1985, Benjamin Libet, L-I-B-E-T, you may have heard of that, made an experiment in which he put people into a laboratory and told them to wiggle their finger within the next 30 seconds without planning ahead, and then to notice the position of a timer in a so-called Libet clock and where it would be located. And he was asked to do that when he was first aware of the wish or urge to act and press a button at that time. And while he was doing that, somebody would monitor his brain for the activity there. And what they found is that there is a preceding brain activity before that person consciously has that urge and wiggles the finger. And so, which suggests that before we make our free and conscious choices, our brain already has made that choice for us. So much for our free will. It is an illusion, and after the fact, we may tell us to ourselves the story that we did that freely, but that is a ex post facto confabulation, as they would say. So there's no reality to it. It's an illusion. It is a story that we tell ourselves. The brain makes our choices for us. Now, Benjamin Libet would say, perhaps we can at least veto these brain activities, these readiness potentials, as they are called. And so we may not have free will, he says, but maybe free won't. We have a veto here, at least. Now, if you tell that to students, that has also effects. Because if that means we don't have free will, we also don't have responsibility for actions. And there are also experiments that show that students with that belief are more likely to cheat on their tests. So there are real-life consequences. Other people will say, well, maybe that's not so bad, because it will give us more empathy even for criminals. They couldn't help it after all. Isn't that a good thing? Every criminal is also itself a victim, if you want, of the circumstances and upbringing and neurophysiology and so forth. Of course, the flip side is then also every victim is potentially a criminal. And everybody should be monitored accordingly. And perhaps we should have brain scans on airports, to figure out the terrorists or something like that. or students before they enter the high school. And if we are good enough, we can do something like in the Minority Report, that movie by Steven Spielberg, right? I mean, we know already ahead of time who's going to do wrong, and we intervene ahead of time. Maybe we should incarcerate people, subject them to surgery, because we already know what they would otherwise do wrong. These are not very good kind of consequences. I don't think we would want that. Background checks for future crimes we have not even committed. There are other problems, and these are all just preliminary observations, that have to do with basically the accuracy of such measurements. Others here will be able to talk better about that. But Alfred Mealy, for example, suggests that these fMRIs are only 60% accurate, which would mean it's basically a slight propensity to do something that we do not necessarily have to act on. So one shouldn't overstate the results of that. It is also to observe that seeing that something precedes something else does not necessarily mean that there's a causal relationship, right? So you see there's a readiness potential in your brain, and then later you have the conscious urge to wiggle your finger. That is, that doesn't mean that one causes the other, even if it happens regularly. It's one of the mistakes that David Hume makes. So night is always followed by day, right? Regularly. Doesn't mean that the night causes day, right? The cock crow may always precede the sunrise, but it doesn't mean that the cock is making the sunrise. So a post hoc is not a propter hoc, as the Latins would say. An after is not an because, if you want. And I'll come back to that question, because that's also important. But it's just an initial observation. I mean, what do you take from data, and what does it actually mean? And the data are there. I think nobody is debating that. And the other thing also is a curious kind of jump to a hasty generalization from sometimes very obscure cases. Now, this is not so much Benjamin Libet, but if you look at people who make claims about that, they usually look at pathologies, schizophrenia, people who believe that they have brought something about out there by telepathy, for example, right? And then they say, well, our free will is nothing else but that. We believe that we have moved our arms just like a schizophrenic believes he has moved the football or something like that. Or people with brain damage. Or something like, alien hand syndrome, or Dr. Strangelove. Stanley Kubrick, that movie. So, I mean, this old Nazi, who's always trying to make the Hitler salute and has to keep his arm down, right? Now, he's embarrassed by that, right? Is that a typical case of free will, a free choice? Would we be surprised by our actions if we freely choose something? Would we be embarrassed by that or try to suppress it? That's not a good paradigm case for free will, but in many cases, that is what people claim. It's surprising. I mean, how often you find that. And then they say, well, again, this is all a confabulation after the fact. Indeed, we don't have free will. Something in our brain or something like that does it. And as one author has it, we are, if you look at our brains, it says there is no distinction between conscious action, reflex, and disease. So you see somebody acting, and you look at the brain, it doesn't look any different from somebody who has just a knee-jerk reflex or a pathology like schizophrenia or whatever else is happening in your brain. On the level of the brain, they say there is no distinction. You cannot see which one is which. And that leads us to our first serious argument about what all of this might mean. Because if that is so, you can also do the same to the neurophysiologist himself. That is, somebody who's formulating the theory that we don't have free will and that it looks all the same as disease or something like that in the brain, will do that also with his brain. And you can look at his brain too. And there's no difference between somebody formulating that theory, someone with a diseased mind or brain, or somebody with a mere knee-jerk reaction? Do you think that a neuroscientific theory is a knee-jerk reaction? I don't think we would want to say that. But then how do you distinguish one case from another? How do you distinguish a true theory about the brain from a false theory? On the level of the brain, both look the same. They both look deterministic if that theory is correct. And to take an example from Edmund Husserl, so let's say you have two calculation machines, right? I mean, a pocket calculator or whatever. Do we even have that? I don't know. It's probably outdated by now. But one consistently says 2 plus 2 is 4 as a result, and the other one consistently says 2 plus 2 is 5. Of course, you would say one is right, the other is wrong. But based on what? Are the laws of electromechanics broken in the calculator that says 2 plus 2 is 5? No, they work in both cases. On the level of the electromechanics, just as for the case for the brain, they look the same. Nothing is broken there. These are laws of nature. They cannot be broken. We distinguish between prescriptive and descriptive laws. The laws of nature are descriptive laws. They describe how things happen all the time. They are, in that sense, indeed deterministic. They are necessary. You cannot break them. You can break prescriptive laws, like traffic laws, canon law, criminal law, laws of grammar, laws of logic, laws of mathematics. These are all prescriptive laws, and we break them all the time, right? I mean, we make fallacies, we break traffic rules, and so forth and so on. And but the laws of electromechanics, or the laws of neurophysiology, whatever they might be, could not be broken then. And on that level, we cannot discern a true from a false statement, if that's the basis for that. How do we then show that something is true or false? Not by the descriptive laws, but by the prescriptive laws. So it's the laws of mathematics that decide that 2 plus 2 really is 4 and not 5. And I can make an argument for that. If I were a mathematician, I'm not, why that must be so. And I make this argument by reasoning from A to B to C. By two premises to conclusion, for example, good Aristotelian syllogism. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so therefore Socrates is mortal, right? That's a logical kind of argument, a reasoning. And I can break those laws. And I ought to follow them if I make a valid argument. Now, if my brain would determine what I think, could I follow that logic? If I must follow by my brain the descriptive laws of nature, am I free to follow the prescriptive laws of mathematics or logical argument? No, because they can do both. They can do both break the laws of the prescriptive laws and not. They can make me make false conclusions and true conclusions as well. That doesn't determine it. I must be free to follow the argument if I am to make a valid argument indeed, and if there is any reasonable truth claim to be made. And that is, my conclusion, if it is to be true, cannot be just a random accident of my neurophysiology that can turn one way or the other. There must be more to that. I must be free from these laws. And so what that would then show is that the claim that science disproves the existence of freedom is a self-contradiction. Because I must be free to prove something in order to show that. Right? So science cannot prove that because following a proof, making an argument, requires freedom in the first place. So that's, I think, a very important thing to realize and take a step back from that, just for the sake of our own sanity sometimes, I think. But it's a problem that you find all the time when people write about that. A second problem is the very meaning of what is being claimed here. And so let me do it this way. So these brain scans, these experiments happen in a larger kind of environment, a larger kind of context. They typically happen in a laboratory where we try to prove certain theories and experiments and so forth. This larger environment is what we call the life world with Edmund Husserl. This is where we indeed pursue our goals, our freely chosen goals, and the means that go with that. And it is for that purpose that we enter laboratories to explore how we can achieve them. It is the possibilities and their freedom which sort of envelop the situation in the laboratory. In the laboratory, we may then try to develop a theory that is deterministic. Theory of brain physiology, perhaps. But what do we then mean when we say that something is determined? What do we mean by determinism? It's the very meaning of that term. And here my own Dr. Father Robert Schwemann suggests, and I believe it's a bit following Henri Bergson, that determinism is a derivative term. How do we define determinism? It is by negation. And what we negate is the ability to pursue alternative possibilities. Here's the range of possibilities, I do not have them. It's only one that's left, basically. I negate all the rest of them. I mean, you can try to define it otherwise. I cannot think of a good other definition. But if that is true, then at least this kind of necessity depends on having a notion of possibility. And that possibility is a range of possibilities and therefore a freedom that we have in pursuing one or the other. And so what we do in a laboratory and what we do with the claims to determinism that may emerge there, we have to see them in a larger context of possibilities from which we begin. And the reason why I think that is important is because that is exactly what you find in the kind of experiments that I just described. It is in that life world, outside of the laboratory, that people make their real choices, their free choices. It is the choice to enter the laboratory in the first place. It is the choice to subject themselves to the experiments that Benjamin Libet and others want to perform. And we lose sight of that because we confine ourselves to the particular kind of laboratory situation and not its context. And as I said, that has to do with the very meaning of the term of determinism, but I think it's also true in many other kind of ways. What do we do if we choose to enter the laboratory? Well, we may have, first of all, certain motivations, such as these experiments will further humanity in figuring out the brain or brain disease or something of that sort. We also promise the experimenter to cooperate and to truthfully report what is going on in us, about the urges that we feel when we wiggle the finger and so forth and so on. Now that is a very interesting kind of thing, because how can we do that? How can I promise to truthfully report, for example, on what I experience if I have no free will? What do I know what I'm going to do in 3 minutes from now? Because that depends on my brain. That doesn't depend on my choice. I wouldn't be able to promise that I would follow through on what I'm saying right now and promise to do. It requires free will to not only enter the experiment, but also to conduct it even. And that, again, is a very important thing to notice, because if you are not able to follow through on that promise, your data will be unreliable. Who knows what you are going to report? It may not be what you actually experience. How can the experimenter rely on your data if you cannot promise to be truthful? And that means that the data cannot show that you are determined, because then the data are unreliable and they don't show anything. So there's another thing where the experiment comes back to bite itself. Then a further point to observe is about the very concept or notion of what we mean by free will. And I said a little bit at the beginning of that, but there's more. And the very concept of free will is important. What do you think free will is? If you do not have the proper definition of free will, you look for it in all the wrong places. So what is implied in Benjamin Libet's experiment? He says they should observe when they experience an urge to act. Is that a description of free will? Or isn't it, first of all, a self-fulfilling prophecy? Of course, the readiness potential will give you the urge and then you act on it, right? You are already rigging the whole kind of scenario in such a way that that's what you should expect. I mean, that you don't even have to make the experiment. That's basically the obvious result. As Raymond Teller says, the experiment treats individuals as passive respondents to stimuli and then discovers that they are passive respondents to stimuli. An urge to act is not, or the experience of an urge to act is not a case of free will. Notice the passive formulation. It is again like, the alien hand syndrome, right? It is, you are the passive bystander of something that happens in you, rather the intentional agent of your own activities, which is what we would think free will entails. You're just observing something that happens in spite or besides your choices and your consciousness, something that arises in you in some kind of a passive way. There have been brain experiments much earlier in the 1930s by Wilder Penfield, where he was able to open the skull and they could poke the brain and then the arm would go up or something like that. Or people even having certain memories at that point. But they would say consistently, well, you did that, not I. And that's very true. I mean, so if you feel your arm going up, and this is it's because you poked my brain, because I didn't have the intention to do that. We know how to distinguish these cases. But in this experiment by Benjamin Libet, you're exactly not supposed to notice that difference, right? Everything is like somebody poking your brain or your brain poking you and your arm going up. That's not a case of free will. That is more like an involuntary knee-jerk reaction or the urge to sneeze or to vomit. It's not a paradigm for voluntary action, right? Sneezing and vomiting, the onset of something like that is actually not something under voluntary control. The ending of that may be under our voluntary control. That's like the vetoing of Benjamin Libet. But it's not a case of free will. It's something very different. It also describes free will as a form of feeling. You feel or experience the urge to act. Do we feel our free will? Sometimes even well-meaning people who want to defend free will say, well, I have the experience of my free will. I would be very skeptical and careful about that, because that can easily be explained away. Anything that we feel in a sensory or emotional or any kind of way usually has a physical kind of basis, and you will be able to find causes for that. Whereas if we act freely, that may not feel like anything at all. That's often the absence of something, like the absence of something happening when I feel something because I choose not to. So free will may not feel like anything. Feelings are passive, our choices are active, and they may interfere with what we feel. In fact, that is part of freedom, to be able to do that. Feelings are most often an obstacle to free will. I shouldn't say most often, but they often are. We call that temptations, right? And if we are free, we mean by that we can choose not to follow our temptations and whatever we feel like. But then to do that may not feel like anything at all. So again, that would indicate Benjamin Libet is looking in the wrong places here. Where should we then look for? So St. Thomas Aquinas says it is not that we should look for experiences of causality or something like that. We should look at the objects of what we choose and how we think about them, namely rational deliberation. Where we can rationally deliberate, and that requires these rational procedures for which we must be free, there we are more likely to find an indication of free will. We all intuitively know that. We think that our free will has to do with our rational deliberation. So let's say you are seated at the table and somebody puts two envelopes in front of you and tells you in one of these envelopes is a $1 million check. And the other envelope is your death sentence. Now choose. And it says, okay. And so you choose the envelope and you choose your death sentence. And I said, I didn't want that. Yes, you did. You chose it. That was your choice. Nobody forced you. Right? And, and you even had alternate possibilities, I mean, so we didn't just leave you with one choice. And so all the conditions should be fulfilled. Yes, but I didn't know what I was choosing. And that's indeed right. We don't think that our choices are free if they're not informed choices, informed by our rational deliberation. And so reason does play an important role in free will, and it does not occur at all in Benjamin Libet's experiment. In fact, by design, the experiment rules that out. Benjamin Libet tells people to wiggle their finger without planning ahead, without deliberating. That is, by design, the experiment excludes a necessary condition for free choice. How can it then be something that measures free choice or tracks it? It eliminates this necessary condition. However, as I said earlier, that planning ahead has indeed happened. It happened before you entered the experiment. You planned ahead not to interfere with something that is not itself your free choice, but something like an urge that arises, that you deliberated about and choose to do. But that's outside of the experiment, that is before you enter into it. And that is where your free choice happens. Now, Benjamin Libet's experiment for all that is nevertheless interesting because I think it does describe certain situations in which we do follow such urges. And that itself can be a free choice. Many of our choices are made that way. For example, how did you get out of bed this morning? If you're like me, being jet-lagged and things like that, so your alarm clock might be ringing, and you may deliberate a little bit and say, should I defy the world and my duty and stay in bed anyway? Somebody else can give the talk, or do I decide to get up? Okay, you decide to get up, you have deliberated, it's a free choice. Now you still may linger a little bit in bed, right? So some people have to get their, blood circulation in the right order before you can do that and so forth. But at some point you find yourself outside of your bed and you don't quite know how it exactly happened, right? Why? Because, you let your body make that choice for you. You nonetheless did do it freely. It was governed by your choice to get up and not defy the world. But then you let your readiness potentials or whatever it is take the place of deciding when to do that. And that itself is rational. And it is rational, particularly if there's not much else to go by. So, for example, if you are in a supermarket, and that's again an example from Alfred Milly, and there are all these peanut butter jars on a shelf. Which one are you going to pick of all of these? There was not much to go by. They're all the same. It's like this famous example of Buridan's ass. If you've heard about that, so Leibniz talks about that. So a donkey stands between two equally large and equally tasty haystacks. And what's going to happen? The poor beast is going to starve to death because it cannot make up its mind. There's nothing to choose by and to deliberate by. Now, in that case, the donkey or us, we would be right to let our readiness potentials take over and make that choice for us. And that is indeed what further experiments have shown. So Aaron Schurger, I don't know if that's how you pronounce that name, in 2010 from the National Institute of Health and Medical Research in Paris, found that things like these readiness potentials are things that are going on in our brain all the time, like the weather or the stock market, the fluctuations. And in that case, we can avail ourselves from that to basically let it determine the moment when we do something or to gravitate towards some indifferent choice. And that's indeed, if you think of what you're supposed to do, you wiggle your finger in the experiment, there isn't much to deliberate about, right? And nothing depends on that, nothing hinges on that. You better let your urges and your readiness potentials take that choice for you. Or not the choice really, but just to determine when that's going to happen. And in that case, here's where I come back to what I said earlier. That may precede your choice, but it is not the cause of your choice. Again, the post hoc is not a propter hoc. The day doesn't make the night and vice versa. But it must be something that regularly occurs before something actually happens. But it is not itself the choice. It's not. The choice is independent from that. It just determines the moment or perhaps, which peanut butter jar it is. So for all that, I mean, talking about Thomas Aquinas for a moment here now. Thomas Aquinas, I said, is not an extremist. So he sees, we have a brain, we have a body, that's all very important. He also believes that we have free choice in the way I described. And what Thomas Aquinas will point out, very commonsensically, almost disappointingly commonsensically, there are certain things we can do with our free will and others we cannot. I can wiggle my finger, but I cannot wiggle my teeth, right? I can move my arm, but I cannot move my liver, right? I also cannot move myself to sense certain things that are not there, or to not sense what is there if I put my hand on the stove or something like that. But I can decide to move my hand away from the stove. I cannot help feeling certain things. I cannot at will conjure up feelings. But I can choose what to do about that. For example, to walk away from them, to walk away from a temptation, from the computer screen, or whatever it may be. That's where we have also responsibilities. I have a certain control about what I want to fantasize about, images, our imagination. I can, by reasoning, talk back to my feelings. I can do something like cognitive behavioral therapy or something of that sort. There are certain abilities that I have, Thomas Aquinas will say, that are perhaps more indirect. And we can persuade our feelings by rational deliberation, for example. But they're not directly under our control. But our choices are also what we want to reason about, and so forth. And there are indeed possibilities, Thomas Aquinas does mention that, where our whatever the physical basis is, may affect our ability to reason, and that can affect what choices we have or whether we have them at all. And so there's a place for psychiatry in Thomas Aquinas as well. So leaving that there for a moment, and we can come back to that maybe later, but how about laws of nature? Now, how about these descriptive laws? If these descriptive laws are deterministic, can we have free will? I would say no, we cannot, based on all the things I said earlier. But what do we make of that? Are there such laws? Thomas Aquinas actually has an analog to that. So the very notion of laws of nature that we can formulate in mathematical equations comes up in the 17th century. Thomas Aquinas didn't know them. But he did have an analog, and that was the movement of the celestial spheres. So the medieval cosmology has the Earth in the center and the spheres going around it. And they're perfectly regular. You can describe them in equations, and you can calculate them. They have geometrical features and so forth. And they are, in a way, deterministic, at least in themselves. They always do the same thing. And in a way that implies some thought of astrology here, but it's sort of the best available science in his day, they influence what happens on the Earth. And what happens on the Earth, though, is not exactly determined by that. At least Thomas Aquinas will say so. But there were questions in his own day where people were suggesting, well, that's all determined by the stars and how they go. That's the fate of the stars that determine all choices, and we don't have free will. And I think that's sort of an analog for what we would say about modern laws of nature determining us. And Thomas Aquinas says, not quite. He quotes the ancient saying, astra inclinant non necessitant. The stars incline us, but they don't determine us. They don't necessitate us. And but there is an inclination, he will say that. And he also is surprisingly pessimistic about how much we will resist that inclination or not. He says only the wise man is going to resist the inclination at the end of the day. You know that we have criminal statistics, right? You can predict how many people are going to commit crimes. There's a law. It's a probabilistic law, statistical law about how many people are committing crimes. Now, crimes by definition are free choices, otherwise they're not crimes, right? How can you predict free choices? How can there be statistics of suicide, for example? So people were puzzled about that in the 19th century, Emil Durkheim and others. But they're not the first ones. The Jesuits in the 16th century also had that observation, and they were wondering, what does that mean? And Thomas Aquinas would have said, well, this is just going to show normally people will follow these kind of inclinations. And he's very realistic. He says we are most likely to be overcome by our typical inclinations when we are caught by surprise, for example, or when we are stressed out, or multitasking, surfing the internet, and then Amazon or Facebook screening what you are choosing and doing and predicting what you will want, right? How can they do that if we are indeed free? Thomas Aquinas wouldn't have been surprised by that. Thomas Aquinas says even we cannot, even in the state of grace, we cannot avoid every venial sin. So at a certain point, we will fall into a venial sin. You're fragile, and there's something like Murphy's Law. Whatever can go wrong eventually will go wrong. So Thomas Aquinas is a bit of a pessimist in that regard. It's just a finite nature that is inclined to these kind of things. But Thomas Aquinas would also say that this does not mean that we are not free. And here these Jesuits I mentioned, so they have, for example, the thought experiment. So if you have 1,000 inhabitants of Madrid, and one of them statistically commits a mortal sin every day, then let's say 999 have not committed a mortal sin and you're the last one standing. Do you have to commit the mortal sin? And they say, no. Why? It is like rolling dice, right? So if you roll dice, there is a statistical outcome. You can predict a certain likelihood of certain things to happen. But every roll of the dice is independent from the previous roll of the dice. It's not that one roll is causally determining the next one. Everyone is independent from the other, and so it is also with our free choice. So these are not deterministic in that sense. They predict collectively, as the scholastics would say, but not distributively. As a collection, there's a kind of a rule, if you want, but not in individual cases. Finally, these predictabilities are of various kinds, and not all of them are a prejudice to free will. There are certain things that we will predictably do precisely because it is the rational thing to do, and we choose them freely anyway. For example, if you are hungry. Hunger is a feeling. It's something that arises from your nature, and it is something that is very important to have, because if we don't eat, we die. So it is rational to choose to eat. And precisely the wise person is going to do that and freely choose to sort of take over that urge, indeed, and eat, even go shopping for it. These are rational choices. It's predictable, but it doesn't mean that you eat involuntarily. All right? This is all part of our voluntary choice. You may have additional reasons for why you do not eat. It's Lent, perhaps, or you're fasting or on a diet or something like that. And maybe a wise person has more reasons of that kind because you have a wider scope of action, a greater sense of the universal good that you pursue as your happiness. But nonetheless, within that, it is rational to eat. And it is predictable too. And so people can predict your shopping behavior for food. But it doesn't mean that you're going shopping involuntarily. And the same is true for certain habitualized actions. So, for example, if you play tennis and you think and freely choose every little motion that you have to make, you probably are a very bad tennis player. You have trained yourself by reflex to do certain kind of things and react to the ball and things like that. And that's not a choice at that moment, but does that mean you play tennis involuntarily? No. Moreover, you freely chose to develop these skills and habits that make you a good tennis player. And that is something we do all the time, and we do as life goes on, as we mature. More and more of our life becomes part of what we have chosen and what we are responsible for. Our free will is not just these individual punctual kind of actions in laboratories or whatever. These are choices that we make and that are cumulative in many ways, and that govern whole swaths of our lives, especially after we have lived for a while. The child may be not there yet, but we are responsible for much of what we have made of our life, including things we don't know and that we should have learned. Culpable ignorance. And that's culpable because free will is involved. And this is true for our technical skills. And they're very important because the technical skills actually free us from the whole, all the kind of little things you would have to think and choose about all the time, to think about indeed wider and larger things, as a wise man is wont to do. They even, and especially perhaps, include our moral habits. If Mother Teresa were still alive, I could predict to you that she wouldn't try to murder me. And that is not because she doesn't have free will. That is because she's a good person. She has made herself a good person by her choices. She has built virtue, a moral habit. All of that makes us predictable, but not less free. So predictability is not necessarily a prejudice to free will. And so we are free by what we have made ourselves to be then to think about larger goals, the ultimate goal of life, our happiness that guides us all the way, and that always leaves us free from all these smaller things. And a wise person will have more things to think about in that regard. We all choose about these things because we have one ultimate and universal end, and that is God itself. And so God is our happiness, and God is the goal for which we choose, and for which we can then also leave all the other finite goods in this life. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Anselm. So, Father, we'll take questions So there'll be a microphone. I'll come around and you'll just indicate whoever you want to take questions from.
Mhm.
And then we'll have a break, and then the next speaker will be at 10:20. So
Okay, let's start with the gentleman behind the in the back. No, yeah, sorry, that's right. Yes, so thank you. And I mean, it's good to hear that about limit, but that's also the the kind of veto that I mentioned. So you can still say no to that. And people have pointed out that what exactly does that entail? So if choices are what readiness potentials make us do, then even the choice to veto something would need another readiness potential, right? So you get an infinite regress, perhaps, of some sorts here. And that may not be the answer to the question, or else you would have to say, well, there is the readiness potential, and I just don't do it. And but and I think that is actually closer to what the truth of the matter is, because to say no to something is not another thing. To say no to something is just nothing. It's a negation, right? And a negation is not a thing. A negation is not a material thing. It's nothing material. It's just simply nothing, right? And I think that's part of the choice that we have, is just to suspend something. And people in the Middle Ages actually discuss that at length. But it's important to notice that's actually not material. I also don't think that can be a full account of free will, because Herman Melville's Bartleby, the Scrivener, that novel. So he's sort of disaffected, I guess, with the world and the mechanics and the material stuff of it. And so whenever he's said to do something, he says, I prefer not to. And so then he finally wastes away and disappears. I mean, this is indeed a possibility that we have, but it's also a bit of a sad possibility, and it's not the full kind of thing of what free will is. That's really also for choosing the ultimate end and pursuing that. So, but yeah, so I mean, that's good. I mean, so this veto thing is important. Yeah. Yes, please. That's exactly what I wanted to say. So if you don't have free will, the data set that's supposed to show that you don't have free will is unreliable. So again, that's how that experiment starts to bite itself. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. So before I answer the last part, I mean, just to acknowledge, I mean, so there is a lot that affects now criminal justice and how we assess things or what we think about that, including that we use AI tools to predict certain things and set bail accordingly, and even the sentencing and so forth, which is actually a real problem too, I think. But it's of course true that certain things, there's mental illness, there's things like that where we don't punish people but send them to an institution perhaps. And we have always done that, and we have always had criteria how to distinguish one from another. Could be complicated in cases, but we did have that. If you don't believe in free will, you don't need all these criteria. Nobody is responsible, right? And why would we say that? So Thomas Aquinas is much more with the normal kind of procedure that we say, well, we have to distinguish. In some cases yes, in some cases no. And there are certain responsibilities that we have, and in some other cases we may be overwhelmed. So if you have brain damage, then perhaps. So is another thing. So people will say, "Oh, I didn't have my coffee in the morning. I cannot think straight." And what does that show? That the brain is the organ of my thought, right? Or if I take drugs, I cannot think because my brain is messed up. It doesn't show that the brain is the organ of thought. It means it provides a necessary condition for thinking, but it's not sufficient for that. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle would say thought cannot have a material organ, but the material organ of the brain does provide what we think about. The internal senses of the imagination, for example, that make something present to our mind, or that process the sensation that comes from the outside. And if you mess up with that, you don't have something to think about, or you cannot think straight anymore. So it does affect your mind, even without being the physical organ of thought. And so that can be the case if you have mental illness or psychiatric problem or brain damage or whatever it is. And we certainly have ways of assessing that. But it doesn't mean that that's the normal case, and that we make that the paradigm case. Normally, we use our brain and we deliberate about things, and we have a range of free choices about that. And you know better what the criteria are, how to figure that out. Yes, then the last person. Okay, the very back. Sorry if I missed somebody over here. important question that I think even Thomas still have to figure out. How does our free choice make things happen in the brain, right? How do you trigger that? How does that work with the laws of nature? Everybody has to figure that out, not just Thomas. But I think that's very much an empirical question. That's where you come in. There you can indeed make experiments and see what actually happens in the brain. But that's sort of the inverse of saying the narrowness potential makes me do it, but rather how do I make something happen in my brain? How do I trigger the readiness potentials, perhaps? Yeah. Thank you. That's very good. Yeah, I think that's enough.